So I'm just showing greatexpectations.io, which is the homepage. Great Expectations is an open source project that does data quality, data validation, data monitoring. We have a fairly specific take on how that can be best done. And I'll walk you through the main pieces. So the core abstraction in Great Expectations is called an expectation. It's an assertion about what data should look like at any given stage in a pipeline. And when we say pipeline, that could be a table in a data warehouse, that could be training data going into machine learning pipeline. It could be almost anything. Just as data flows through systems, you're going to have lots of places where you want to be able to assert, here's what it should look like at that point. And we do everything from kind of schema checking, null values, regexes, to more kind of anomaly detection type things like checking column medians, or not shown here, correlations, checking to make sure the distributions of values match previous distributions within some range of tolerance. So it's declarative, it's very flexible. It's also intended to be very extensible. Aside from just having these assertions, we've also set it up so that you can translate back and forth between tests and documentation. So all of your tests can be converted into what we call prescriptive documentation, which just says, here's what the data should look like. You can also generate descriptive documentation, which is, here's what the data actually did look like at a given moment. And then what we call diagnostic, you can say, okay, if what it was supposed to look like and what it looked like were different, then you can also generate docs for that. And we take a pretty expansive view of what a doc is. That can be static HTML or Markdown, it could be a Slack message. We've got some cool stuff where people actually auto-generate notebooks that make things editable, and the notebook itself is just another type of documentation, another rendered format for the expectations themselves. Last, and this is a piece that's still very much in progress, partly just because there are a lot of moving parts to it, and getting the APIs right, making it work fluidly in a lot of circumstances is a legitimately deep technical question, is automated data profiling. So being able to take existing data, or in some cases metadata about that data, so like schemas from SQL, for example, or logs, and based on that, put together candidate expectations. And our philosophy and the kind of feedback that we've gotten from the community is, you shouldn't imagine that you can automatically profile data and know everything you need to know about it. There's always going to be a role for domain expertise, kind of fleshing out those roles. But it's a very good starting point, and it can be really helpful for getting your test deployed quickly. So last two pieces, we have kind of a whole stack to help people set up data validation and to make that work in a recurring kind of ongoing monitoring type way. I won't dig into details here. And then last, it's open source, which means that everything is very pluggable, very extensible. And our philosophy is very much the developer needs to stay in complete control of the whole end-to-end experience. And that means anywhere you want to extend or add to the code, you can. So that's Great Expectations in a nutshell. We've been working with the Flyte team for a while to integrate these tools more closely because they just fit hand in glove. So I'll turn the time back to, actually, who is doing the demo? I'm not sure. Who's got it on your side?
I'll be doing the demo.
Okay.
Yep.
Let me turn it over to you.
Yep. Thanks, Abe. That was amazing.
Yeah, thanks, Samhita.
Now let me just give a brief overview of what the Great Expectations integration does and how one has to use the integration. So let me just share my screen first. Yep. So in Flyte, we already have a native type system that validates the type of data. But what if we want to validate the data all ends up, and we want to make sure that our data follows a specific criteria? In such a case, this plugin comes in handy. With the Great Expectations and Flyte integration, we can make the Flyte pipelines more robust and resilient. We can ensure that new data isn't out of line with the existing data. We can prevent data quality issues, eliminate bad data, etc. Now, how do we define this integration? So this plugin comes in two modes. One is task and the other is type. So what's a task? task is a simple Flyte task. So you can just assume that this is a predefined Flyte task that you can call from within a task or a workflow. Now, what's a type? A type is a custom type that you could attach to your data. In our case, it's the Great Expectations type. Now, both task and type can accept a string, a Flyte file, or a Flyte schema. A string refers to a file name or a database query. A Flyte file is useful when you have a remote data set. Like say you want to validate the data that's present in a remote CSV file. In such a case, you can use Flyte file. Flyte file automatically downloads the remote data set, and the plugin then validates that file. Now, Flyte schema is useful when you have a data frame, like a pandas data frame or a Spark data frame. In such a case, you can use Flyte schema. So Flyte schema automatically creates a Parquet file out of the data frame. And that is what the plugin validates. So this is basically the inner working of the tool. Now let's just look at a couple of examples to understand these concepts better. Firstly, I'll be showing the Great Expectations task, in that the Flyte file example. If you see this particular code snippet, we have a workflow here. And in that, we have the dataset parameter. Now, this dataset parameter has the CSV file type. Now, CSV file is like a varied representation of Flyte file. It's just like a combination of Flyte file and the CSV extension. Now, this data set is a remote CSV file, if you see the URL in here. Now, I'm passing this data set to the task. Now, in the task, I'm again calling the Great Expectations task, which has a couple of values in it. Name is the name of the task. Data source name is the Great Expectations data source. Input is the data set, and its type is CSV file. We also have the expectation suite name, data connector name, local file path, and context root directory. So context root directory is the directory in which you have your Great Expectations main configuration file. So if you see this configuration file, this is the Great Expectations configuration file, and this is present in this particular directory, and that is what I'm mentioning in here. Local file path is the path to which your file is downloaded. So this has to be given in case of Flyte file and Flyte schema. You also have to make sure that local file paths directory and base directory in Great Expectations have to be the same. We have plans to remove this particular value because we want to automate this part. But for now, you'll have to input this value. Now, when I run this workflow, the validation happens automatically. And if at all the validation fails, this is going to throw a validation error, and it's not going to proceed to the next line. Only if it passes will it proceed to the next line. Let me also show you a Great Expectations type examples. Now, this is Flyte schema. In Flyte schema, I again have a workflow. I'm calling a task within the workflow, and I'm passing a data frame. Now I'm fetching this data frame from a different workflow. So if you see this task, I have the data frame. Now the type of this data frame is Great Expectations type. And in Great Expectations type, I'm passing two values. One is the data type. This data type is Flyte schema. You can also give Flyte file or str, meaning string. And the second value is the Great Expectations config. This configuration is similar to the config that I've shown you before. We also have local file path in here, which basically means that this is the path to which the Parquet file will be copied. Now, there's also runtime batch request. So runtime batch request is the Great Expectations runtime batch request that can wrap either an in-memory data frame, file path, or SQL query. Now, the difference between the runtime batch request configuration and the other configurations is that the data connector that's being used in here is different. Now, if you see this data connector, let me just, yeah. So if you see this has a class name set to runtime data connector. This is what differentiates this from the other configurations. So you'll have to make sure that the class name is runtime data connector. Then the plugin automatically converts your request to a runtime batch request. You need not specify any additional parameters to tell that. And yeah, pretty much it. Let me also show you how the validation error looks like on Flyte console. So if you see this, the validation has failed in this case, and I can see all the column names against the expectation names. We also have plans to integrate Great Expectations data docs with the Flyte UI, but for now, this is how you can debug your data. Yeah, so that is it. You can find all the code examples in the Flyte documentation. If at all you have any questions relating to the Great Expectations configuration, just refer to their documentation. Let us know if you have any suggestions or questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Samhita. I had a question for Kyle and Abe, maybe. So where do you see, like, how do you see most of the folks in your community using Great Expectations? Like, do they use it as a way to, to codify the expectations of the data, or actually as a validation framework where they are actually running things, and the compute in there?
It's some of both, to be honest. And what I'm hearing is an echo of the conversation that we've had a few times on, is this like monitoring or is this typing? And I think the answer is yes, like it's both. What I would say is, I think most teams that come and start adding data quality checks to their pipelines tend to think of it more on the monitoring side. But then as time goes on, you realize that surfacing of that as metadata earlier in the process, using that to align on expectations, becomes really helpful. I mean, if you think from kind of a non-engineering standpoint, like what are these expectations? You can think of them as tests, which kind of puts it at the end of the life cycle of development. But you can also think of them as requirements, which puts it right at the beginning of the life cycle of the development for a data product. And I mean, as far as we're concerned, yes, they're both. I get that people tend to want to put tests in after they've burned their fingers and something's broken, so they tend to put it in at the end. But I think the way the data world is moving, and I mean, you guys on Flyte, I think, have some really good ideas on how data typing will flow forward and inform future data development. I think those things are going to end up being largely the same thing. Give it a few years. Okay, I don't know if that's the question you're asking.
Yeah. Yes, I think we kind of communicated without really saying the same terms. That's amazing. But no, thank you. Yeah, I think what I like, when I had a conversation with a couple of the users, they tend to think about it from the monitoring or the end. And I'm like, what about we bring it earlier? But the same thing that you did in the end, what if it automatically pervasively goes throughout your system? And that's our point of view, because that actually empowers them to slowly improve the quality at the source, while of course keeping their workflow as is, which is to start at the, once you have the data, don't burn your fingers right early on, as you said, but get things rolling and then slowly improve pervasively. But yeah, thank you for that explanation.
I'll say, I mean, if there's anybody who wants to kind of wax philosophical about, or more practical, but just like where this is going to go, I mean, this is a technical thesis that I've had for some time. I think tighter notions of typing just really haven't existed outside of schemas and SQL, which I think are a very loose type of typing. And I think there's been a lot of notion around how how the data world needs to learn from the software world. And I think testing is one of those concepts that's kind of been brought pretty fully in, which is one of the things that's driving a lot of the enthusiasm, just, why Great Expectations has become such a big project. But I think there's a comparably large set of ideas around, okay, how can typing really help the data ecosystem? And I haven't yet seen that flowering of ideas, and it feels like we're probably due pretty soon. So if there's anybody who wants to chat about that or go deeper, we'd love to just riff on that, come up with content together, because I think there's quite a bit to do there.
Yeah. Just for folks to know that Abe and I have been talking about doing some sort of a series, essentially, to talk about typing and potential powers of typing in data world.
I'd just add, this is refreshing to hear more people talking about, given how much I was banging my head against the wall in a prior role, trying to get other people to think about this. How early can we introduce and enforce types in our pipelines, whether it be batch or in the stream.
Yeah, totally with you. And with so many people working in Python in the data world, where types are, very optional, I think it's going to take a while. But I think there's a lot of benefit there, and partly what I'm searching for, what I'm hoping people will come up with, maybe even in this kind of intersection communities, is if we can come up with a few hero experiences, like just really powerful things that happen because you had types earlier. I think that'll start to open people's eyes, because not that many people are willing to change the way they code just because it's philosophically better. But if you can say, oh, this bad thing will stop happening, or this good thing will start happening, then yeah, things can move faster then. So if you have ideas like that, if you encounter those kind of hero experiences, please speak up and we'll figure out how to boost them.
Proof, right? Kyle, do you want to add something? I thought you were going to say something.
No, nothing specific, but yeah, feel free to also jump into our Slack community. I'll put in a link over there if you need any help with Great Expectations. Always happy to help people coming in.
And thank you for joining our meeting today. So this really helps.
Yeah, thanks for having us. And thanks for doing so much of the heavy lifting on the integration. It's really cool to see it come together.
Yeah, thanks, Samir. That was awesome.
Thank you.